The LA Times are in a really interesting poll where they asked the same voters over and over and over again what they thought about Clinton and Trump. And there were huge swings in the African American subgroup numbers that they reported week to week. And when they went back and looked at it, there was one 18-year-old Black Republican who was in their sample. And on weeks that he took the survey, it moved the Black number for Republicans 10 points by himself because they had such a small sample. And the weights on this one guy, because he was so unusual, were so high that if he skipped the survey, it looked like Hillary Clinton was doing much better with Black people.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for another fun-filled episode of Power and Flour. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what is going on in U.S. politics in 2024, and we also care deeply about pastries. Today, our focus is going to be on polling.
Everybody's favorite topic.
Yes. Should we believe it? Is it reliable? Was it once reliable and now less so? Is it a problem if they don't call you? There's lots of things to talk about here. And this is something that I've played with polls. I've used polls a little bit in the past. John is very steeped in this and has used them a lot over the years and has organized them and studied them. So we're going to do this with me mostly asking John a lot of questions. But okay, let me just start off with sort of a big overall one. And this just data from a couple of days ago. Starting with the example, if you look at the average of polls on 538.com, the U.S. presidential race right now is roughly tied at about 43% for Joe Biden, 43% for Donald Trump, with RFK Jr. at about 9%. There was a survey, one of the surveys that goes into that average. There was a Survey USA one from a few days ago that had Trump at 45% and Biden at 43%. Okay, and that's pretty typical with a lot of polls we've seen. So my question for you, John, is should we believe that?
I think we should. I've got more hesitancy on that than I would have had a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, for sure. But there's a lot of things we got to put in context for that. I think the first is, like with any poll, it's a snapshot in time. So that poll with Trump at 45 and Biden at 43, that's what's happening today. There's no reason to expect, though, that that's what's going to happen, 4 months from now, 5 months from now on election day. We are, for the last couple cycles in presidential elections in the US, we've had really stable and pretty boring elections where things don't move that much. And I think that that's given a lot of people a false sense of certainty that, what the polls show in May or in June is going to be what the polls show in October or November. But historically, those really stable elections have been the exception, not the rule. But polling has gotten a lot harder. We live in a world where, when a lot of the polling methodologies that folks rely on, both media pollsters, but also private pollsters working for candidates and campaigns, and academic pollsters, a lot of the methodologies that we use were developed in the 1950s and 60s for a world that looks very different than our world looks now. And we have a lot of work to do to keep up with that. Smart pollsters have been doing that work and have been working really hard to make sure that their polls are as accurate as possible. But, the world changes so quickly, it's really hard to keep up with. Seth, in your work as a political scientist, have you changed the way that you think about polls and how much stock you put in them?
One of the areas, I appreciated some of the points you made in there. One of the things I like to tell students is that polls are, they're not a forecast, they're a snapshot. They're a picture of what an election looks like now and how people would vote if the election were today. That's not necessarily the same as telling them what is going to happen 4 months from now or 3 months from now. I think of them as I always have, just because as far as I can tell, they're still roughly as accurate as they used to be. But I do recognize that that masks a lot more work that goes into making them more accurate. We used to always think of it as the gold standard was, having just a bunch of people on phone banks, just calling people, with random digit dialing. And I know that's not necessarily the most optimal way to do it anymore. And also, like, something I was teaching my students like 20 years ago was like, one of the sources of bias in there is that it can be hard to make sure you're getting a random sample of the population. So like 20 years ago, it was an issue that like there was a growing number of cell phones, right? And so some people had more than one phone number attached to their name. And some people, it used to be hard to find people on cell phones. And it seemed like it was mostly wealthier people who had more than one phone number, or it was younger people who have more than one phone number. And younger people didn't have landlines. So like those were issues a while back. And, we sort of knew that pollsters were dealing with those questions, but it was never really clear what the obvious solution to those were. And now we're just like in a totally different world from that. Like, it gets, I know that pollsters are constantly adapting to it. And it still amazes me that we can get people to respond to these things at all.
Well, we can't get very many of them. Most of I took a couple poli-sci classes in college. My degree's in theater, so I didn't take that many. But I took enough to, get a bit of an academic grounding. And when I was being trained in this, the gold standard is what people call probability samples, right? So like you said, you're trying to give everybody in the country the same odds of being included in the sample, which we used to accomplish by, people just dialing random phone numbers and talking to whoever picked up. We are just in a world now where that's almost impossible. When George Gallup was doing that in the 1950s and 60s, they would expect that 1 out of every 2 people who they would attempt to survey would take part in that survey and would agree, pick up the phone, talk to a stranger, give them their opinions about politics, and end the conversation. We're now in a world where with a lot of the samples that we're looking at, when you try to do that same old-fashioned way, it's more like 1 out of 200 people will actually take that survey. It's worse if you're dealing with hard to reach populations. It's worse if the survey's long. It's worse if you want to test a lot of messaging or, force people to deal with things that they don't really want to talk about. But more and more people, it's easier than ever to opt out of surveys. And folks are opting out in huge numbers. So we're left with the kind of person who will talk to a stranger for 20 minutes in some cases about politics is fundamentally different than the people who won't. So if you call 200 people and only one of them will take the survey, the odds are really good that that one person is much more politically engaged, much more politically aware. Right now is much more likely to be a hardcore partisan. The voters who are undecided, who are, harder, are conflicted, maybe they think they don't like Trump, but they think they might vote for him, or, they're pro-choice, but they don't really care for Biden. Those sort of more interesting, really important demographics that we have to understand. Those are the people who don't want to talk about politics to a stranger. And when you call them up at dinner time, when they're thinking about other things, when, they're chasing their kids in the house, or, they're tired after a long day of work, the last thing that a lot of those people want to do is get into a long discussion for free with a stranger. So they just don't.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So, well, this raises a really important question. And this is, I've been continuing, I've continued to be surprised by the relative accuracy of these things. That is, as I understand, like polling forecasts of presidential races typically miss the mark by about 3 or 4 percentage points. I mean, I think that's pretty standard, and that hasn't changed a lot over the last several decades. So they underestimated Biden's support in 2020. They overestimated Joe Biden's support in 2020. They overestimated Hillary Clinton by a bit in 2016. The midterm elections in 2018 and 2022, they got pretty close on average. Did not miss by a lot. So I get the fact that, as you point out, polling is increasingly drawing a sample of people who are very interested in politics and who, just by definition, don't act like or look like the rest of the population. are we are they just sort of getting lucky that this is a roughly representative sample, or are they just, are they doing sorts of magic to make sure that that weird group of people still looks like the rest of us?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think the first point is that they, yeah, we one of the behaviors that correlates with wanting to take a poll is voting. So particularly in low turnout elections, the kind of people who want to take polls look more like the kind of people who are going to turn out in a low turnout election. I think it's one reason that the results have been more. The polling averages have been closer in midterm elections because those are lower turnout on average. Um, some of it is the kinds of there's as many Republicans who are fired up about politics as there are Democrats. So some of it can't stop. But then the pollsters also do a tremendous amount of weighting. So a pollster will go into an electorate and say, and I'm simplifying this a bit, and so pollsters who are listening know that I'm not trying to downplay the really important and difficult math you do, but just to explain to folks who have not been on the inside of this, a pollster will go into an election saying, we think that the electorate is going to be 36% registered Democrats, 34% registered Republicans. We think it's going to be 53% female, 47% male. We think 32% of people in the electorate will have college degrees. And all of this is based on previous similar election data. So we know who votes in elections. We have a lot of information about voters. You can use that to create a likely voter universe for similar elections in the past. So, we may know that the electorate in a certain area should be 18% Hispanic voters, 15% African American voters, whatever those numbers are for the race and for the election and for the state or the geography. And so if the sample that they're getting looks a lot different than what it should be, they can up or down weight those responses. So, for instance, every time you do a poll, you get a lot more older voters who take the survey than they should, looking at the share of the electorate. The electorate as a whole is very old. The median American voter is 54 years old, which is something I try to remind people of all the time. But the median poll taker is significantly older than that. So usually we'll have, if a random sample of 1,000 people should have 500 people over the age of 50, we might have 700 people over the age of 50 instead. So those responses just get weighted down, and their share of their impact on the overall number is reduced. The hardest population to sample or to get on the phone to take a survey, in my experience, is younger Latino men. Right, Latino men under the age of 50, very difficult to survey. So it may be that you want 50 of them, and you only get 25. In that case, what many pollsters will do is simply double the impact that each one of those people has in the overall final numbers. Now, the problem is you can see on that is if those 25 Latino men are not representative of the broader population of Latino men, then magnifying that just increases that risk of error. And I think where we have run into trouble has often been that, if the kind of younger Latino men who want to talk to a stranger about politics are less representative than the broader community of younger Latino men, then we start getting into trouble. And I think that's where some of the bigger polling misses that have happened in the last few years, like, you mentioned in 2022, on average polls were pretty good, but most of the polls showed a small single-digit lead for governor of Florida when Ron DeSantis won in a landslide by, I think it was 15 or 16 points. And I think some of that is the samples, particularly in those fast-growing younger states, we just didn't have the right kind of people, and the upweighting made it even worse.
Okay, yeah, I'm actually that was really helpful, by the way. And you were talking about the difficulties of adjusting the weights for like these smaller subgroups. I actually wanted to ask about like a lot of polls. We'd often see these top line numbers where they say this many people like Biden, this many people like Trump, but some of them will get into the subgroups within a poll. So there was,
Sure.
there've been a number of major polls over the last 6 months or so showing, for example, they sort of focus on like young people, or they focus on Black people in their survey and find them less supportive of Biden than they were than those groups were in the 2020 election cycle. And I'm wondering, like, how believable is that? Just, I mean, we've seen that in several different surveys. It's repeatable. But is there a concern that we're drawing just not a very representative sample of people, or is this actually capturing something that's real?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's not an easy one to answer because unfortunately, like with most things, the answer is it depends. But uh, a good poll, let's say you do 1,000, a representative sample of 1,000 voters nationwide. Of those 1,000, between 120 and 150 should be African American, based on the proportion of African American voters in the general electorate. Um, Now, the margin of error on that smaller sample is a lot higher. If the margin of error on a 1,000-person poll is a couple percent, the margin of error on the 120 to 150 subsample is going to be dramatically higher. So right off the bat, you're dealing with less accurate data because it's just noisier. In statistics, the larger the number of respondents, the lower the margin of error, the less noise there is, because the impact of one or two people has less, moves the numbers less. So what a good poll that's trying to do, to really speak to where Black voters are moving or where Hispanic voters are moving, will do what they call an oversample. So sometimes you get people misinterpret this when they see these things online. But so that same poll, if they wanted, let's say, 400 African American voters to give them more confidence in understanding what's happening in that community, could still do 1,000 representatives nationwide and then interview more African American voters to get a more accurate subsample. That doesn't change the overall number. That's not saying that 40% of the likely voters in the final sample are Black, because they downweight those, but then there's a larger number for the oversample. So a well-constructed survey can give you really interesting information about crosstab subgroups, but it's also easy to way overstate that. My favorite example from 2016, the LA Times are in a really interesting poll where they asked the same voters over and over and over again what they thought about Clinton and Trump. And there were huge swings in the African American subgroup numbers that they reported week to week. And when they went back and looked at it, there was one 18-year-old Black Republican who was in their sample. And on weeks that he took the survey, it moved the Black number for Republicans 10 points by himself because they had such a small sample. And the weights on this one guy, because he was so unusual, were so high that if he skipped the survey, it looked like Hillary Clinton was doing much better with Black people. So you've got to have as many grains of salt as you have for the top line number of a poll. You need a lot more for these subgroups. I will say, as somebody who's looked at Democratic polling data for Democrats for a really long time, it's not unusual to see African American voters being disproportionately undecided early in a campaign. It's not unusual to see. I worked for campaigns in Ohio and in Virginia and a lot of other states where you might see that the Democratic candidate was getting 50 or 60% of the African American vote, and the Republican candidate was getting 5 or 10. It was just a large share of voters were undecided. Often what happens is once name ID goes up, once the campaigns begin in earnest, once folks are on TV, knocking on doors, in the mailboxes, a lot of those undecided voters, think of themselves as Democrats, sort of move back to the Democratic candidate. Obviously, that doesn't always happen. There are Republicans who've done a lot better than 5 or 10%. But it's not an unusual pattern to see large numbers of undecideds. And I think that's what we're mostly seeing in the Trump and Biden race right now. Recording this on July 2nd, we are, Biden has a significant lead among voters of color, but there are a lot of undecideds. And those undecideds, in the data that I've been looking at, are disproportionately younger voters and really disproportionately men. And I think that there's a really big warning signs for Democrats that, we absolutely cannot take for granted that the younger people of color, particularly younger men, and even more particularly younger men who didn't go to college, are going to vote like other folks in their community without a lot of outreach, a lot of work, a lot of listening to voices from that community, making sure that we're not taking that for granted, because Trump and the Republicans are communicating with those voters all the time.
That's a
That was a
really
very long-winded response to your
okay.
question.
Yeah. No, that's a really good answer. This is reminding me, those who are sort of following the polling controversies after the 2016 election, where basically every poll had Hillary Clinton winning, and most people who were doing polling aggregation just assumed a very high probability that Hillary Clinton was going to win. For what it's worth, at the time, Nate Silver at 538 was doing a couple of pieces talking about, in the lead up to the election, saying the percentage of people who are undecided is higher than usual. And that was adding a certain level of uncertainty to the models. That it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to win, but they were having a hard time saying what, first of all, why there were more undecided so late in the campaign, and then just sort of speculating what those people were going to do. And the undecided they did not split. They leaned overwhelmingly toward Trump, and they just went toward him in the end. And that was kind of the whole story. So, I guess I sort of wonder, first of all, could that end up being a latent Biden vote? Like, these are people who are not comfortable saying they're going to vote for Biden, but it turns out in the end they will, because they historically do. Or I guess these people they could also be leaning Republican and are just not comfortable saying that because they're, in traditionally Democratic communities, or they just might not end up voting. I guess, but it adds a lot of uncertainty to these forecasts.
It adds a ton of uncertainty. And I think the old rule of thumb when I was coming up in campaigns is that you assume that 2/3 or 3/4 of the undecideds break to the challenger, right? That because usually the incumbent is well known, the challenger is not well known. If you haven't decided to vote for the incumbent, the odds of you coming around to that position are pretty low. But we don't live in a world like that anymore, right? Like, the challenger, in this case, Trump, is incredibly well known and incredibly disliked. And so I think a lot of those rules of thumb are just less valuable than they ever have been. To me, the clearest...
Yeah, it's not that when you have two presidents running against each other, it's not that helpful a rule of thumb. Right.
I think just like in 2016, what was unusual about that race is that there were a lot of undecideds late, and it's absolutely the case. What's unusual this time around is how unhappy voters are with their choices. We are in, your expertise is on parties. We're going to spend a lot of time this year talking about why parties work the way they do and how we've ended up with what we've got. But because of completely rational choices that the parties have made, we have an election that most voters don't want. And I think that that's going to absolutely change the way that, how effective polling is. I think a lot of folks may set this one out. I think we may see higher than usual third party vote. Typically we see third party vote go up when folks are unhappy with their major party choices. And so, I think that's what's been driving some of the RFK support. That certainly has the potential to drive some vote for Cornel West, for Jill Stein. I think the impact of that's going to be really interesting to track over the next couple months.
Okay. So let me just ask, what is a good poll for you? What's the hallmark of a good poll? What do you look for to know whether something is a quality polling instrument?
So it's a great question, and it's tough. And, I'm going to ask you too, so make sure you think of an answer.
Okay.
I think the first thing you need to understand is, what is the poll for, right? Like, most of the time, a media outlet is doing a poll because they want to know who's winning or losing, and maybe they want to understand a few things about the electorate. That's not why campaigns poll, right? If you want to know if you're winning or losing, and you're running for governor, or you're running for Senate, you're running for president, for the most part, you could just, look at the polling averages. The reason that campaigns poll is because they want to know what to do about the election, right? They want to understand who's with them, who's not, what messages are the most likely to move folks, what demographics are the most in play geographically where those folks live, so that they can build a more accurate campaign. So if I'm evaluating a poll that's trying to tell me if someone is winning or losing, what I'm looking for is transparency in how the poll was conducted, as much information as you can get about who did the survey, what the was it online, was it over the phone, how were folks selected, as many demographics as can we can get. So what proportion of the respondents are women, what proportion of the respondents are Democratic, Republican. Really importantly, what proportion of the respondents are college educated. College educated people are much more likely to take surveys than non-college educated folks are. So those things are really important. And then finally, I'm looking for the shortest polls possible if you're trying to understand who's going to win or lose. There are folks that will tell you how they're going to vote. A stranger calls them, they'll talk about politics for a couple minutes. But if you start getting into these long winded surveys where I'm going to read you 15 names, tell me what you think of them, or, a lot of folks are busy. They have too much going on in their lives. And a lot of pollsters, if you don't take their entire survey, they will not include your partial. So one thing we saw in 2016, a lot of voters would tell you that they were voting for Donald Trump. But then when you started asking questions about why, right, they would opt out and they would hang up. And I think in some cases it's because maybe the why was not, and this is my partisanness, the why wasn't really something they were proud of. And so instead of saying, well, I'm voting for it because he makes me feel good, they just hung up on the pollster. So that's what I look for when I think about sort of a public facing media poll. For a campaign poll, it's a lot different because you need to have a longer survey. You need to have a lot more information. And so, in that case, it's often the reputation of the pollster, right? Like, have you worked with them before? Do you know that they do high quality work? Do you know that they're going to give you good advice coming out of that poll, which is the reason you did it in the first place? So, that's how we sort of think about polls as practitioners. As a political scientist, what do you look for in a good poll, and what do you teach your students to look for?
For me, one of the things I focus on the most is transparency in their methods. That is, do they explain what they've done? If something's written up in a newspaper, if they put out a memo or something like that, has the polling organization clearly explained, here's when we sampled people, here's how we went about doing it, here's the precise questions we asked people, here's whether it was a machine doing it or whether it was a human. Like that, all that information is really important to me. And I find that some of the sketchier organizations just don't tell you a whole lot about how they got what they got. I'm surprised, but it's true that the reputation matters a lot with this. I look for some names, if I see like Morning Consult, or if I see Ann Seltzer, or if I see Civics or something like that, like those reputations carry some meaning, and I know that, okay, they have some history of doing this. In particular, you want places that, have a history of not quashing polls that look stupid. That's actually bad practice. Like, just by law of averages, every once in a while, you're going to get some weird results. And polling organizations should be just transparent about this. They should publish it and not try and align it to what other things are going on out there. And numbers are good, but you can have 30,000 people in a garbage poll and 500 people in a very good poll. So it's the thing I tell my students is like, you can have a lot of faith in something as long as you have faith that it's a representative sample. And if there's things that make you question that, then the rest doesn't matter how many people you have in there. The rest is garbage. But of course, what makes for a representative sample is always a little tricky. Which actually brings me to, I guess, a last question for you. If, as you talk about, like, this is just getting harder and harder to do, this is getting more expensive to do it right. We're getting weirder people who actually answer the phone and are willing to talk about these things. What might replace polling? Obviously, this information is still important to the media, to voters, to campaigns. What does the future look like? What are we going to be doing 10 or 20 years from now?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it's something I spent a lot of time working on in my career. So I think the first thing that's going to replace polling, and it's for a lot of campaigns, it's already replaced a lot of polling, although not all of it, but is using more sort of big data analysis to understand what's happening in election. As I said before, we know a lot about who turns out in elections. We have voter files that we get from official government entities that say somebody's name, address, and what elections they voted in. And then a lot of data has been appended to that. So, likely race data, data about, if they're likely to have a college degree, what kind of neighborhood they live in, what the average commute times are in that neighborhood. And then, in some cases, some commercial data that comes along with that. So, magazine subscriptions, frequent flyer mile information, the stuff that is out there and accumulates about people. And that gives parties primarily the ability to make really accurate projections about how individual voters, first of all, whether they're going to turn out or not, and then how they're going to vote. And usually the way that those are built is by doing very large surveys with 5 or 10,000 people, but only 2 or 3 questions long. We're really just trying to understand a few things so that we can then see, all right, here's the people who told us they were voting for Joe Biden, here's what they have in common, and we can build a statistical probability for every single voter in the country for how much they look like the people who told us they were for Biden. And then at that point, it's a math problem, right? If somebody is 50% likely to turn out, but 100% likely to vote for Joe Biden if they do, that's 0.25 of a vote. And we do that calculation for everybody in the country and add it up, and it gives us very precise ways of making projections about where a race stands at a moment that are used widely. So I think, that's one way. I think, when you're trying though to understand messaging and impact and how we can change voters' opinions, we're looking at doing a lot more qualitative research and a lot more testing. So what a lot of campaigns have started to do in the Democratic space and in the Republican space as well, although you're more of an expert on what Republicans are up to, is instead of calling somebody up and saying, I'm going to read you 10 messages, tell me which one you think is the most important, they'll make 10 different TV ads and they'll show them to voters online and then ask who they're voting for and use these large sample testing platforms to say, oh, people who saw this ad, 3% of them moved toward our candidate. That's a really effective ad. Or people who saw this ad, 5% of them moved against our candidate. This isn't working. We don't want to use this message. So rather than, giving people, a small group of people, a lot of messages, they're giving people actually produced content and seeing what moves them. And I think that's a really interesting way that campaigns are moving.
Okay. This has been really good. And I think I would like to pivot to our pastry tips section.
Oh, thank goodness. That's enough polling. Let's talk about enough polls. Let's talk about rolls, right?
Hey, there we go. Simple question. Do you have a favorite thing you've ever baked?
So my favorite thing to bake is croissants. When I was a little kid, the first thing that I remember just loving was like, you get to eat this, like, it's just like butter and air. And it's just it was incredible. And for as long as I can remember, I've loved them. And during the pandemic, I decided I was going to teach myself how to make them. And it's been a really long process and I have been refining it. If you follow me on Instagram, you've seen some ugly ones that start. But I've gotten now to the point where I can do it in my sleep. And I think they're better than what I can buy. So that is absolutely my favorite. It's a lot of work. My butter budget is out of control. But I love doing it. How about you? What's your favorite thing to make?
So I like making more political things. One that I really enjoyed, I was part of this dinner club group for many years, this supper club, and we had like these big blowout meals for presidential elections. And I made a dessert just prior to the 2016 presidential election that was supposed to be sort of like Donald Trump's vision. So essentially what I had this enormous plate on which half of it was apple pie and half of it was this giant flan, and it was separated by a wall of graham cracker. I was very proud of that. It was building the wall, and both sides were truly delicious, and you could break down the graham cracker and mix the two. You could take the symbolism wherever you wanted to. I'll post a photo of that on our Substack at some point.
That sounds incredible.
Okay. This has been a really helpful discussion. Thank you so much, John.
Yeah. I love talking about this. So hopefully it was helpful to folks out there.
Yes. Thank you all for listening today. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much for listening to Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Eli Maskett. We will be recording throughout this election season up until the November election.